All right, let's get started again. Hopefully everyone had a good lunch and the opportunity to stretch your legs. We've got our third presenter for the day coming up, our equity fellow, Dr. Bret Stephenson. Bret is going to speak to us on his fellowship titled Centering Equity in Data and AI Governance, Informing Policy to Empower Practice. Can we welcome Bret, please?
Where's the clicker? There it is. I owe off the top
That's next.
a
That's
huge
back.
That's
Laser.
Laser, goodness, okay. Let me try this. Okay, it does work. I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Anna for helping me with probably the worst PowerPoint failure I've had before a major presentation in my life. I'm going to have nightmares for years to come about what I've been through. And Anna, thank you very much for your patience. So I'll pull myself together and hope that with each click something happens. I should start by saying that, unlike the other fellows today, that mine is still a work in progress. I had a bit of a health setback last year, and so I'm still going into the final report. So there's still quite a bit of analysis to do, but there's still plenty to share today. Okay. So I might just start with, we were just talking about this, a few of us, is how we all have different levels of understanding around data governance, certainly around AI. I don't know all there is to know, but to give it a bit of context, I might start with a story that I used and many of you have heard in this room, and that is my very first act as a teaching academic. I think would have been, 2003. I had my very first teaching job in Baylor University in the Environmental Studies program, the largest Baptist university on the planet, right next to the Western White House where George Bush was summering. So that gives you a sense of what the place was like. And I had been told by my supervisor that I must take attendance. Bret, you must take attendance. So I'm ready to take attendance. I've got everything together. And the way they took attendance was through those clickers, right? You know, you pointed at the front of the board. Got to do the clickers, Bret, got to do the clickers. And then I got up to a podium just like this, and through the side door, by the way, this was a required course, so there was about 200 students here, my first time teaching. A man bigger than me comes through the side door, approaches me, and introduces himself. And I'll tell you, he was the highest paid person in the university. Do you want to guess who it was? The football coach. And the football coach said, here comes my team. They're going to sit in the first 2 rows every day, and the quarterback sits there. And then I found out that the ladies' basketball team sat behind them. And he said to me, you've got to take attendance. And I said, yes, sir, I will take attendance. And so, kind of like my PowerPoint this morning, of course, the clickers fail. They're not going to work. And so the quarterback says to me, why don't we just send a sheet of paper around and everybody can just write down, their details. And then I said, great, please do that. And he said, would you like our student numbers? And I said, sure, let's do that. And so this paper goes all the way to the back. And then at the end of the class, young lady came up and handed me the papers, and I'm looking at them, and it has names and it has these numbers. And the numbers only went to about 40 students, and then it stopped. And then I said to her, why would only 40 students give me their student number? She said, oh, because that's our Social Security number. And they have to give it to you, and we don't. And the context there is that effectively athletes at American universities, especially like Baylor, where the average cost of tuition per year for a four-year undergraduate degree is approaching $70,000 a year. And the student athletes are effectively our equity students, right? And they are truly, it's almost completely students of color, and then just a sea of whites behind them. And when she said that their student number is their social security number, I realized that my first act as a teaching academic was a major privacy breach. Not only that, but when you think about it, what she meant was when she said they have to, the coach just came in and the professor said, me at the front, everybody's a professor if you're teaching. The professor said, yes, I'd like your student ID. So it's a perfect example, I think, of the power asymmetries that exist, particularly in student equity data. We can think of many, many examples. There are power asymmetries in terms of students with a disability status and who gets to know that. It can come between you and being selected perhaps for entry to a master's degree or whatever it might be if it's a competitive situation. There's also, of course, tensions between individual and group privacy rights in the equity world. The way we define equity is group equity. And it's important to keep in mind that when you're identified with a group, that is information, right? And then there's really difficult questions about who gets to make decisions about that data, right? What's representative? All right. And then inequalities in information vulnerability. It's something I've really picked up on in talking to people all over the sector, is that we all have very different, let's call it, privacy kind of personalities, the way that we view our personal information and such. And we tend to bring that into our professional practice. We don't all have the same kind of privacy budget, certainly, that some of us are far more informationally insecure, that things being learned about us can put us at great disadvantage. And so please just keep all of this in mind as we go through. Those students that I had in the front rows had a very different power relationship than the students behind them, and they were certainly more informationally vulnerable than I was, or again, the students sitting behind them. So student equity data, what is this powerful but risky stuff? So many of you would know this and understand this, but it necessarily contains personal, often highly sensitive information about individuals or groups. This can be cultural, financial, health, well-being, personal hardship, personal identity, life circumstances, carers, of course. Personal hardship data has been really eye-opening throughout this fellowship, just learning about all of that deeply, deeply personal information that flows through the university system and its various levels of security. Have any of you looked through the ACSES questionnaires, the special entry access scheme when applying for, say, equity points for ATARs and such? Your hands will sweat if you look through what the TACs, the tertiary admission centers, that kind of data that they require to prove whatever status for whatever entry scheme you may be after. Those data are incredibly sensitive, often include personal hardship. This data is collected in a variety of ways. It can be required. It's just the terms of admission, you got to give us your postcode. It can be volunteered or self-disclosed. It can also be derived from other sources, so piecing together other bits and pieces of data. kind of like we do with the postcodes and SES status. More and more, it's being inferred through predictive processes from mother data. These are kind of like for the data nerds. It can also be observed, of course, more and more as we're involved in digital learning environments. All of that, those digital traces are recorded and they are being made part of the way that we now digitize and see students. And all of this is done with tremendously varying degrees of transparency, notice, and consent. And boy, has there been a deep conversation in recent years in Australia in particular around notice and consent. And many of you will know that in universities, especially if you've been around a while like me, we put an awful lot on those collection notices at the point of enrollment, don't we? That we told them we'll use their data maybe in these kind of vague ways and such, and therefore off we go. We'll come back to that. So to be clear, I'm not a complete Luddite by any means. My first life was in the more quant side of things. I introduced the predictive learning analytics program at La Trobe University, learned to code, all those things. I've lived in the data world, but I've seen what can go wrong. So I do understand that when well-governed, these data can bring significant benefits to individual students, to the groups they're a part of, to the public good, but we need this data and we need to be good stewards of it. So really, my fellowship is looking into how can we be good stewards of it? So when I was at a conference earlier this year, towards the start of this fellowship, it was a noisy room. I was sitting at a table and I just met a woman from Canberra and she asked me what I was doing and I gave her the title of my fellowship and she said, "Oh, we do a lot of work in the gray, don't we?" And I thought, that is perfect. Yes, that's exactly what we do. We do an awful lot of work in the gray. And since then, I've been trying to figure out, why is it so gray? Why is there so much gray in the way that we handle student data, the way we collect it, the way that we fail to be transparent in the ways that we use it? And there are many, many reasons. We'll talk about quickly the law in Australia, privacy law, is very much out of date. Because of that, also compounded by the rate of technological change, and the law is always trying to catch up with technological change. And it's just plain hard. If you've ever made your way through, say, your university's data warehouse, the management of those systems and the governance that goes around them can be, I think, one of the most difficult jobs in the university. So central concern of this fellowship is really to understand the experience and views of student equity practitioners, senior leaders, and how they work in the gray, the problems that they've encountered, how they overcome those problems, and really how we can find ways out of this gray area. And this is a bit boring, sorry, but just for the data nerds out there, just to say, when I use the term governance, I'm talking about all the ways that we bring transparency and, good decision hygiene around the way that we adopt technologies that involve student data, the way that we use and collect student data, policies, legal mechanisms, ethical principles, which have absolutely exploded with Gen AI recently, particularly the way that we conduct stakeholder relations, and really the whole decision-making structure. So, okay, so this was my fellowship. Wildly ambitious looking back, but 4 areas of focus. So I break this into these 4 basic areas. I want to look at the legislation and regulation and policy that creates all of this gray, and boiling that down to what's required of unis as we handle all of this data. I also looked at university policies and what unis say they're doing. And then for the first time in my life, I took a jump into qualitative research and conducted interviews with practitioners and university leaders, again, wanting to understand the challenges, the risks, the opportunities, and really our readiness for digital change. And then finally, good practice and identifying good practice here in Australia, of which there are some really exciting examples that I hope to share. And next, so we'll start with legislation, regulation, and policy. And here, to explain how complex this is, if you have a graphic design background, you're probably having a bit of anger at me right now. I just wanted to show just how fast things are changing. I mean, you know, equity in Australia, as we understand it now, was really born out of a Fair Chance for All in 1990. It was just 2 years before that that we got the Privacy Act. We were just getting our heads around the way that we're going to control data. Then we got the Martin indicators 4 years after that, 1994. You should read the 2 books on the Martin indicators. They are so interesting because they really go through all of these tensions that, you know, practitioners are having around this new practice of collecting sensitive data and reporting it to government. There was a lot of discussion around this problem of privacy and the proper handling of student data. I won't go through all of these, but then HECS, of course, came in, and there's more data reporting to government. And we were progressively getting changes to the Privacy Act throughout the early 20s, or the noughts, and then, what do we call it, the teens? I think the important points here are that really since 2020, we've had just breakneck speed, more and more advice from government, legislation on both data and AI, of course. And a few of these are worth going into detail on, but probably not today. Okay, except for this one. I think if you know nothing about data privacy law in Australia, it's good to just have a general sense of these 2 tensions. And I think it's really represented by these 2 offices. So this tension between the need for privacy and the protection of data, but also the need for sharing and making the most of the public good that data can bring. We find this kind of embodied, in my mind, almost literally and kind of metaphorically, in terms of the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, the OAIC, and they're the independent regulator for data privacy. They're there to promote, you know, privacy. They put out fantastic guidelines on, you know, how to protect personal data through the adoption of generative AI and things like that. Get on their mailing list. It's fantastic. On the other side, the ONDC, the Office of the National Data Commissioner, you may have heard of the DAT Act, the Data Availability and Transparency Act of 2022. Your university may be signed up to this, but it's fundamentally the office that is working to basically mobilize publicly held data for research purposes, for the improvement of processes and such. And really, that's what our universities are struggling with, those 2 things: protecting student data, respecting the rights of students, but also mobilizing and making the most of data for the public good. So if you keep those 2 things in mind, I think is just one really helpful way of understanding what these tensions are, both in government and in each and every university. All right, a few words on the privacy legislation. So it hasn't really been profoundly updated since 1988. I would never speak ill of this country and its laws, so I'll let the Attorney General Mark Dreyfus speak for Australian privacy law. It is woefully outdated and unfit for the digital age. And it is the source of an awful lot of this gray that we all feel when we're sitting there with very sensitive student data. So the Privacy Act review came out in 2022, and the government response followed in 2023. So of the 116 proposals to modernize Australia's privacy framework, the government's response, they agreed to 38, 68 agreed in principle, and just 10 noted. So there are likely to be profound changes coming to the Privacy Act. In fact, there already are. The first tranche was approved in November, and some of the more important points are that it introduces a statutory tort for serious invasions of privacy. You can sue now. Privacy law, really, your only right in Australian privacy law was largely to complain if your rights were violated or your privacy was violated. Now we can sue as well. Organizations need to update their privacy policies. I think this comes into effect in 2026 to disclose when they're using automated processes for important decisions. It'll be interesting to see how that's interpreted in the EU. Basically, most automated decisions around education are considered high risk because they believe education is important to a thriving life. Also clarifies reasonable steps to protect the security of personal information and indicates that you need to have both technical and organizational structures to protect data. There'll hopefully be even more exciting reforms forthcoming in tranche 2 around definitions of personal data and deeply looking at consent. All right, very quickly. I think privacy professionals around Australia really key in on the centrality of notice and consent in our privacy law and what it means. And it's often seen as the key weakness that brings about all of this gray. And the government has agreed in principle to tighten up what this means, what consent means, and that it should be, and it sounds very much like how we think of research ethics consent, voluntary, informed, current, specific, and unambiguous. Now, ask yourself, are we collecting data like that now on our students in all ways? Probably not. And so many universities, as I've learned, like my own, have gone on this sweeping kind of mission to just simply locate where all of their collection notices are and mapping those to data sources to understand what we're telling students now. And many universities are working to improve those already. All right, so analysis of university policies. I'm not going to linger on this, but I've gone through, done the sector-wide analysis of Australian universities, both Table A and B, their policies and governance documents that relate to the collection, management, and use and control of student equity data. My goodness, there are dozens and dozens of these, sometimes in just the one university. So data governance, of course, privacy, equity policies, success retention, research, evaluation, AI, where they exist. I've looked at all the support for students policies, which has been amazing. Too much to say there. All relevant and publicly available policies, procedures, and guidelines were collected in March to May 2024. So there was over 1,000 in the end policy documents, which I actually genuinely bought a more powerful computer just to do the analysis. It's half the reason why my PowerPoint went a bit haywire today. So some of the key questions there: what are the common models for data and digital governance in universities? How is student at-risk monitoring being disclosed in terms of transparency? How's it being described? Just quickly, looking at the support for students policies, I found 6 that even mention this. And they all except one, I think, are incredibly vague. You would never understand what they were doing with your data, none, or how they're profiling you. But there are good policies out there. Reviewing AI policies and governance docs, there's very few. They're slowly being added, but as you would imagine, many of them focus only on generative AI, which has come up quite a lot in the interviews that I've been doing, kind of this disappointment that that's all we're talking about. All the AI air has been sucked up on generative AI and academic honesty and such. All right, so is there clear governance and policy relating to evaluation research activities involving equity students? Are these governed and how? I'll come back to that in a minute. But here, just to say that I'm looking for examples of where equity is centered. So for instance, are data sovereignty, indigenous data sovereignty concerns reflected anywhere in student policies? Do you want to have a guess? No. Are they reflected in research policies? Yes, quite often. But you do get these very vague notions in many privacy policies about, respect for certain unnamed groups, right? Okay. Anyway, very interesting, but a bit boring in a PowerPoint slide. So on to the qualitative bit. So the research aims there were really to understand the views of student equity practitioners, university leaders, and data managers, analysts, concerning the approach to data and digital governance in their institutions, the challenges that they have encountered in collecting, controlling, using equity data, and the opportunities they see for improving the governance and responsible use of student equity data. So adopted a semi-structured interview approach held via Microsoft Teams. I thought these would be 30-minute interviews. I just ran the numbers and it's just over 1 hour average for each interview. And they've been fantastic. I've learned so much. There's too much to analyze though. So the participants were selected on these criteria. They're a staff member at an Australian public university, Table A. Their role may be described as a student equity practitioner, but also senior leaders involved in management or strategy for equity. And then I added later, went back to the ethics committee, added their role is significantly related to the management or governance of student data. Because you find that trying to put the puzzle together, nobody has the full picture of what is going on in universities around data and digital governance and what is happening with student equity data. So I realized that I really need to bring in the data people as well. So far, this is still a work in progress at about 20 participants. And just to say very quickly that the overall kind of spread in terms of, the level of role, the type of role, but also where they're, just to make sure that I had good coverage in terms of particularly disability focused roles and First Nations data evaluation. And also importantly, that last one there, data or eval stewards. So those are senior people who are given the role of being responsible for student data, right? Okay, so all uni groups have been covered, 7 states and territories, 12 unis in total. And very quickly, it's important to note just that all of this took place in this wildly changing policy context in higher education. There's been a huge amount going on, and that's probably why I have gone even grayer in this short period. But very quickly, you may have heard of the Universities Accord, but of course, it has an ambition for us to be collecting much more student data to improve and enhance and get more granular indicators of disadvantage. And that means, more sensitive data on students, which requires, much better governance, much less gray than we currently have. And of course, the Accord really called out problems with disability data, and that's been a real, I won't present much on it today because there's too much to say, but just about everybody wants to talk about our care and handling of disability data. The support for students policy has come up again and again and again. There's quite a bit of frustration with it as well. Concerns about student privacy. This is from Universities of Australia and their feedback to the government on their policy paper. There are additional concerns about student privacy, the appropriate risk management concerning the handling of identifiable information that could be potentially damaging if mishandled, financial data, access history, well-being services, and identification of at-risk status. So, to the best of my knowledge, the support for students policy is the first time that we've really had this kind of government, mandate to, I think the terminology it uses is to do proactive intervention with students at risk. And it's been really interesting, even just reading the support for students policies as to how that's been interpreted, whether it's reactive or truly proactive, whether it's predictive and such. So many of my participants have wanted to talk about this and their approach to these both predictive and propensity models. Also in the mix would be the implementation of the CHIEF, I still don't know how to say that, which raises issues about the governance of evaluation activities within universities. Of course, we have a research culture. We know how to go through human research ethics committee approvals and such, but when it's evaluation or quality improvements, the governance tends to drop off, and that's, of course, of no surprise. But just to say that it's certainly a concern for various reasons, because evaluation necessarily involves the use of student data, and there's all kinds of questions around decision-making and governance and such. Okay. How much time do I have? Can I ask? Sorry? 14, yes, okay. Because I got to get to the examples of good practice, because those are exciting. I'm really excited about those. Okay. So just to say, this may be my pet concern, but I'm really concerned about the way that we do evaluation and the way that we are, whether we have good decision hygiene around who gets to decide who gets to do what with data. And I can tell you from working in a central data adjacent area, it's political, and where there aren't, good decision hygiene, it can get gray and quite poor sometimes. And my research participants have spoken to this quite a bit. I just want to say that the national statement actually says that institutions should have clearly defined decision-making processes around this for determining whether an activity is research or if it's another activity, such as quality assurance, and have separate mechanisms for the review and authorization of each, right? The review and authorization of each. And these mechanisms should be set out in the institution's policies and procedures. This is why I needed a new computer to try and find the examples of this. In health fields, it's much clearer. In health fields in 2014 was published by the National, my eyes have gone, the National Health and Medical Research Council, the Ethical Considerations in Quality Assurance and Evaluation Activities. Just to say, if you want to see an example of good practice, that's a good place to look. And of course, it's, I think, something that we can learn in universities from the health field. In health settings, medical settings, it's quite common to have clinical practice ethics committees, which are different than research ethics committees. And I'm actually going to show you an example of that in an Australian university. Whoops, wrong button. Okay, and here's where I kind of want to apologize because there's too much good stuff to come out from all of these interviews, and I'm going to do a terrible job. But I just picked out a few themes to give you a sense of what's going on. So really, I thought I might just address the sense of, governance maturity that people are feeling in universities. And I'd say that it's largely low. There's a few good stories out there, but it's largely pretty dim, this sense that we are not ready for this bold digital world. I won't read all of these, but so our university, I would say, is at a relatively early stage in terms of digital infrastructure, and it's at an even earlier stage in terms of its data governance, particularly in relation to equity data. There are examples, people are very quick to say that even where there's generally bad practice, that you can find that one area that really knows what they're doing, really cares, and is really policing what is happening within their remit. Okay. This was a bit of a shock to me, to be honest. I spent all this time analyzing university policies thinking, this is what universities do. They do what they say. Ridiculous. So I've been talking with interviewees about how policies inform actual practice on the ground. And these are largely the responses I'm getting. So policies, whether they exist or not, are certainly not in the culture. There's a gap between what is rhetoric and what is, well, it's just rhetoric. What the practice is not what is clearly stated in the rules. We have lots of policies. These are the rules. There's no connection. It's fully known. It's not like, whoops, there's a gap. It's like, So anyway, I won't read this one as well, but there's a litany of these. Views on transparency and consent. So here's one, but my view is that it's probably not explicit and clear enough about how we govern the internal access to student equity data across the institution, and it's a bit slippery. Again, the gray. I mean, while we take all this information from students, we never talk to them about how it gets used or how it's going to go sit on this dashboard and be available to whom for what purpose, right? We could go on and on. I think that we need to be more robust in the way that in which we evidence voluntary and informed consent for the use of those data. Here we're talking about data used in evaluation. A big theme that I'd like to call out is that many participants talk about these individual gatekeepers, these lone local heroes that are, holding the shield up between the corporate powers that be that want to exploit student data, and hearing stories about when those people leave and it all falls apart, right? Also hearing lots of stories about more junior equity practitioners raising these concerns with senior staff and it being, again, career limiting to do so. I've heard career limiting again and again and again. There's a lot of leaning in and whispering into, an MS Teams meeting. I think that deserves a lot of attention and thought in our equity communities. There's a few important challenges with time, it looks like. I have 5 minutes. Challenges with the data stewardship, custodianship model, this kind of high-level controllers of data. And here's just a few. Several senior data stewards believe they have poor visibility of how the data is being used. They have a sense that something's happening and it's not in their control. Lack of clear decision rights around who actually controls the data. And there's different, of course, models of, say, who owns student data. I shouldn't say own because, well, for legal reasons, that's not right, but who has responsibility? Is it student services? Is it the DVCA? Who decides when this powerful dean wants to do this with student data, those kinds of things, and there's no policy to dictate that that can't be done, those kinds of problems. Many staff at lower levels are unaware of the governance model, had no idea, and it's undermined by frequent restructures and staff changes, of course. Okay. I'm going to skip ahead and get to the good practice. So we have time. So a few examples of good practice. One of the, or at least, well, no, I'll say good practice, emerging practice, innovative practice. And there are just reams and reams and reams of documentation on this, but the Enterprise Data Ethics Framework at QUT is really worth a look. It's certainly trying to do the right things, and there's really too much to say about it. One interesting bit for the data nerds is that they have this practice of internal data sharing agreements, or at least they've tried it, and that is when your area wants this data from the central data and analytics area, well, then we have this agreement as to how it will be used and for what purpose, and it's very clear. It looks a bit like a privacy impact assessment. Moving down, they also have a data ethics advisory group, and this is what I was just saying, where we need examples of something like a clinical evaluation ethics committee, not a research committee, but something different. All right. I've been talking with Gail Crimmins and her team at UniSC about their fantastic new work. They've developed this Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Ethics in Data Advisory Group. The objective of the EDI group is to consider and advise on matters pertaining to equity, diversity, inclusion, and ethics in data as they relate to the management and use of information across the university. And it's still in draft, but they're working on this data protocol. And just I highlighted a few of my favorite bits of it: a commitment to data minimization. If you don't need the data, don't take it. Ensure transparency in data and decision-making. And really importantly, a commitment to continuous learning and improvement, which I've heard a lot about in these interviews and the sorry state of it in universities. And finally, the example from UTS and their work utilizing deliberative mini-public DMP to develop principles to govern the use of analytics and artificial intelligence in teaching and learning at UTS. And this is interesting in a lot of ways, but I think the central way that I find interesting, because one of the questions, we all want student voice, and I'm not an expert in student voice, but keeping in mind that, what is representative in doing that? Does just this select group of students that identify with disability, do they make decisions for all students? We have problems with selection bias when we do that. We get, the very, how do I say it? The very outgoing students who insist that their voices be heard and such. And so what they did was they put out a call for membership in this deliberative mini public, and they got, I think, 131 applicants, and then they did basically stratified sampling to try and make sure that the group was representative. And in doing that, there's something of, randomness, so that you don't just get these very strong opinions. That comes up quite a lot in these conversations with practitioners about, again, who decides, how do you get student voice? And more in both law and universities, we're thinking about, at what level of individual choice will students receive? What should they receive in terms of being able to determine the uses of their data and such? Okay, I think I'm out of time, surely, but I might. Oh, I rushed the, I'm done. How's that? Why don't we?
Bret? I think your presentation was equal parts entertaining, informative, and made my hands sweat. It's something that I think we all should be quite worried about and mindful about. And well, I'll just say one more thing. Apart from the area of data governance, I think we also work in a lot of other gray areas in the university, but this is something that really should make us really worried and make our ears prick up. Again, I'm going to move to Q&A. We've got one question, but keep those questions coming. The first question is, in addition to considering consent to use equity data, have you considered exploring conditions when it's reasonable for such consent to be waived?
Well, I mean, that is the question. So in human research ethics, in the national statement, there is a consent waiver and there's conditions for the consent waiver. I think so, but really, yeah, I don't know.
And the conditions are usually when harm is minimized, when it's non-identifiable, and when the data is not of a particularly sensitive nature, which I think, the subject topic you are talking about over here, student data, particularly student equity data, by its very nature, is going to be of a sensitive nature.
Yes, but even it can be de-identified. But many respondents, myself as well, respondents, I should say, participants, have raised questions about oversight in terms of evaluation, even with de-identified data. So here's very quickly my opinion. Research ethics, I used to teach ethics. My ethics are largely drawn from feminist ethics. Many in feminist ethics believe that ethics is something we do, it's something we do together. It is participatory. And that's really what human research ethics is. That's kind of the good bit about it. It's not lone individuals. It's not an algorithm deciding who gets to do what. It is a committee process, and there is, human oversight. And that's what I think is missing in terms of even evaluation and who gets to decide when consent is waived. Yeah.
Great, thanks. I think that's a very obvious gap in university systems, that when something is not classified as research, it just goes to another area, and very often such an area does not exist. Thanks for that, Bret. Is it possible to build best practice solutions into IT systems? I assume university IT systems.
IT systems.
Yeah.
Sorry, can you ask one more
Is
time?
it possible to build best practice solutions into IT systems?
Oh, well, yes, I've read lots of studies, of course, of asking students what they want and such, and that is one of the frequent kind of requests that you get. Well, we have a dashboard, show me all the data that you have on me, and then let me click, which data uses I approve of. And in Australia, we have examples of that. We have myhealth.gov. Is that what it's called? My Health Record. We have the consumer data right. I don't know if you've been to that website, but you can choose who gets to share your financial information. So why don't we have the same for students? And so that would be an example. But it's not to say it's uncomplicated. Yeah.
Just realized that we should put up the Slido QR code again. Okay, thanks, Bret. You mentioned powerful corporate interests trying to exploit student data. Can you expand on the student detriment concerns? And can you also provide providing access to or selling this data to commercial interests?
Oh, I've been trying to. So I'll try and remember both parts. I'm going to start with the second part. So the second part, the on-selling of student data. During, I think it was last year, the ACCC, I think, put out their report on third-party data brokers in Australia. And yeah, if you're a privacy head and you want to stay up late at night, you should read that because it's quite disturbing what can be done with data because of our weak privacy law. I would recommend a paper by Janine Arantes at Victoria University, and I can't think of the name of the paper, but she wrote about government to business data transactions in schools with school data, school student data, and business to government both ways, going back and forth. And I've been asking around, trying to find examples of where universities are data brokering in this way. And I have nothing to say about that, but it's simple. I mean, you can here, one example would be buying in data, because every university is just like vultures. These data brokers are ready to sell you the data that they have on your students. It's very unclear whether that's happening or not. But particularly in the other direction, in terms of universities sharing data outwards, I've found no examples of that. And I've forgotten the first part of the question, but
yeah. So I guess it's reassuring you haven't found any examples, but I guess under the current framework, it's possible, or there's no.
It's very confusing because it's so gray. And so if you're in Victoria and you're an equity researcher and you want to buy in some data to enrich your data set on your equity students, say you want to figure out who comes from a single parent household, can you do it? Well, you go to the privacy commissioner in Victoria, that's not their name, it's OVIC, the Office of the Information, yes. They say under normal circumstances, public government entities will not bring in data in that way, but it's all vague, right? It's not letter of the law.
There's a lot of operating in the gray again.
Operating in the gray. And another example would be anybody can take student addresses, go to Google, buy all this information about their commute times and things like that. That's enriching data sets. Say you want to add that to your predictive model. Questions, who decides, right? You can go to your privacy officer. Yeah. So there's lots and lots of questions about that inflow and outflow of data and data enrichment. It's probably different in every state.
Thanks, Bret. Let's move on to the next question. Could you please comment on the impact, if any, of unis having very many different data systems, both within universities and across universities?
I'll tell you, it's almost a joke now because the data silos and the data management immaturity of many universities is their privacy protection, right? So in the sense that even, a senior so-and-so will say, even if we got hacked, Bret, good luck to them because I work here, and I cannot get the bloody data, right? And so it's like, well, I guess that's your security policy, is it? It's almost by design.
Our weakness is our strength.
Yes. Yeah. But I would say spare a thought for your data governance and data management people, because their job is terribly difficult to bring data into a single source of truth, the data warehouse, properly labeling it, properly giving it access and controls. If you think you've done it well, please put on a workshop and show the rest of us, because it is so hard.
Your fellowship was focused on university data policies and practices. Do you have any comments on government collected and published student equity data and/or the intersection between universities and government?
Sure, I would say, I'm thinking of a few, I'd rather talk to the interviews that I've had, and I've been surprised, even at a senior level, the sometimes real concern around demographic data generally, and the perpetuation of deficits and such. and around the support for students policy, insisting that we report on these demographic deficits. There's a particular question on the report to government, and there's this sense that government doesn't understand what this data means or how it should be used, I think. And I don't need to tell people in this room or on this web stream that there's real concern around SES status and all of its meanings and
Accuracy.
sorry?
And accuracy.
Accuracy and misuses and such. Yes, I don't know if I've answered the question, but
we will let you go on that one.
yeah.
Current human research ethics committees consist of researchers, but the committees sit within the central university areas. This provides a degree of independence. If we had a general ethics committees for activities, including when equity data is used, where in the uni would it sit and retain independence?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't have the answer, but so some of these, anything like this committee, obviously, some of these decisions are made almost entirely in IT, right? It's the data and techie people making decisions about what happens to data and where it goes, or what's an appropriate system for these purposes in, say, the disability area and such. So whatever it is, you need broad representation. You need to bring security, data governance. You need to bring community representatives, teaching and learning and such. So you absolutely need diverse teams. And that's what you see. So that example from Sunshine Coast and their advisory group, they are very intentional about having the techie people and the practitioners all in the one room making decisions together. And that brings transparency. I can't tell you how many times I've heard about predictive analytics and how nobody knows what the hell is happening with predictive analytics in their university, because transparency is non-existent and it lives only with a small little group of analysts somewhere tucked away. Yeah.
Thanks, Bret. We'll go to the last two questions in the interest of time. Did you find any good or bad examples of ICT procurement or policies where student data was protected from external vendors? And I'm not going to read out the examples, but you can look at it.
Yeah. Yeah, procurement policies are in there with the 1,000+ policies that I've downloaded. I actually haven't gotten to that folder yet because I'm scared of it. And I'm stuck on contracts at the moment, which is another big issue in privacy as well. So no, I don't have a good answer to that. But briefly, contracts. Contracts are often data agreements, data sharing agreements in Australia. So if you're contracted with any external entity, there's probably a bit in there about how you'll share data. If you're a student or a staff member, and you want to understand how your data is being shared, this actually gets back to that earlier question about data going out. Good luck to you. I mean, because if you're not named on the contract, you're probably never going to see it. And if you ask too much, you're probably up for redundancy, you know, those kinds of things. And so the transparency, even in the contracts, in terms of how data is being shared, is a huge issue, but it's not just universities, that's Australian law. Yeah.
Thanks, Bret. This is a good question to finish with, but what are the key questions to put to senior management to get them in this zone on this and to orientate them to the horror?
Yeah, it's not all horror. There's good practice. Gosh, you know, I don't know. I've got one of the themes that I'm developing from all of this is the data cultures, right? And often described as being incompatible. You know, there's the techie business side, you know, all those new hires from Telstra or whatever it might be. And equity practitioners are trying to make their concerns known to them or trying to, you know, make the system through which learning access plans are distributed more fit for purpose and such. And I keep hearing the story again and again. And of course, I've experienced it myself, where these two are speaking different languages, have different values, have different goals and such. So I don't know standing here right now if I have a magic answer to that, but it certainly has something to do with transparency, and it certainly has something to do with more democratic decision-making in universities as well. And that's why I get quite excited when I see these examples of trying to bring those decisions into the light for all to see and understand and contribute to. Yeah, it's a very hard one, I think.
Hopefully, after your fellowship report is published, we'll have everyone in the sector will have a series of good questions to put to their line managers to get them started thinking about solutions. Yeah. Great. Thank you very much, Bret. That was informative, entertaining, and making us sweat a little bit. And I think we do need to sweat. So let's thank Bret.